The arrival hall breathed like a cathedral that had learned to hum. And Elias Rowan stood within it with his coat still smelling of cold transit. Feeling the floor's slow vibration pass through his boots and into bone. He had crossed a measured distance that the galaxy called 3 centuries. Yet his heart carried only the weight of one interrupted afternoon on Earth. People moved around him with soft urgency, robes and armor whispering, while banners of a realm he did not know drifted overhead like held breath. He felt her before he saw her, a pressure behind the eyes, a pull in the chest, as if memory itself had learned to reach across time and take his hand. Elias lifted his gaze, and the world narrowed to a single figure beneath the arches. Gold light sliding along metal and skin, gathering in the crown she wore. Her posture was perfectly still, not the stillness of patience but of certainty. And when her eyes met his he understood why distance had failed to erase him. Recognition struck like gravity rediscovered after years of careful floating. A murmur spread outward from their shared stillness, a ripple of disbelief. But Elias heard only the thud of his own pulse and the soft catch of her breath. She did not move toward him, and he did not move toward her either. As though some fragile law governed the space between their remembered selves. Her face held centuries of resolve shaped into calm, yet emotion burned through. Not grief or triumph, but the quiet shock of an answer finally given. Elias realized then that history here had been waiting on this exact second. He remembered a laboratory with cracked windows and rain on concrete. Remembered laughing as a prototype gate sang itself open for the first time. They had told him the jump would be brief, that relativity was well mapped, that he would return with data and stories before dinner grew cold. The universe had disagreed, stretching the return path into an epic of absence. And Elias had slept through it all in a coffin of light and equations. Waking now, he felt no heroism, only a human ache for context and home. Her name surfaced from somewhere deeper than memory, carried by instinct. And he spoke it without sound, shaping it in his thoughts like a vow. She inclined her head slightly, a queen's gesture stripped of ceremony. And that tiny motion shattered the tension holding the hall in check. Officials began to speak, translators chirped, guards shifted uncertain weight. Yet Elias saw how her gaze never left him, never flickered toward distraction. He wondered what kind of endurance it took to become this unmovable. The air smelled faintly of incense and ozone, a blend of ritual and machinery. And Elias felt suddenly underdressed for the life that had grown without him. His hands, still marked by grease scars and old burns, curled at his sides. Tools not symbols, evidence of a species that built first and asked later. She noticed them, he saw that clearly, and her lips softened in response. As if those small human imperfections confirmed something she had always believed. The universe had changed, but he was still undeniably himself. When she finally stepped forward, the sound echoed like a struck bell, and the space between them folded inward, no longer sacred but inevitable. Elias took one step as well, then another, legs steady despite the moment's weight. And with each pace he sensed unseen systems recalculating futures in silence. This was not conquest or conquest avoided, but contact delayed and resumed. A reminder that persistence could look like love when stretched long enough. Humanity, he knew dimly, had arrived here without knowing it needed to. She stopped an arm's length away, close enough for warmth to matter. And for the first time her composure cracked into something openly human. Her voice, when it came, carried an accent shaped by years of ruling. Yet his name within it sounded untouched, preserved exactly as he remembered. Elias answered with a nod and a breath he had been holding since waking, aware that entire civilizations leaned forward on this exchange of syllables. 300 years had passed, and still the simplest greeting held power. Behind them the hall resumed its careful motion, history continuing to turn. But between them time felt newly forged, flexible, open to gentle shaping. Elias sensed that his survival had become a story others told for meaning, while her waiting had become legend refined into expectation and hope. Neither legend mattered now, only the fragile truth of shared presence. He did not yet know why she had searched for his face alone. But he knew, with human certainty, that he had arrived exactly when needed. The warmth between them lingered as the hall's attention slowly redistributed. And Elias felt the subtle shift as authority bent around her quiet presence. She gestured once, and the layered murmurs thinned into respectful distance, leaving them framed by light and shadow, as if the world itself stepped back. Elias noticed how her shoulders eased only then, tension released by privacy. And he understood that power here was not shouted but carefully contained. The centuries had taught her control, yet they had not dimmed recognition. She spoke again, softer now, explaining with measured clarity that the hall was only the threshold, not a place meant for truths long delayed. Elias followed as she turned, her steps confident but unhurried, guiding him through corridors where stone met luminous circuitry. Every surface carried layered histories, old arches reinforced by glowing veins, and he felt humanity's familiar logic woven into alien craftsmanship. It felt like seeing his own handwriting echoed in another language. As they walked, fragments of explanation reached him, offered without ceremony. She told him of the accord worlds, of treaties shaped by restraint and memory, of how humanity's brief flare into interstellar sight had altered the balance. Elias listened, realizing that his vanished afternoon had become a turning point. A human reaching out with curiosity instead of conquest, then disappearing. That absence had left questions that centuries could not bury or replace. His species had become a lesson rather than a threat, and that mattered. They entered a chamber open to the sky, where banners stirred in warm air. And for the first time Elias truly saw the city beyond the hall. Structures curved upward like grown stone, threaded with transport lights. And distant spires caught the sun in slow, deliberate brilliance. She paused there, allowing him a moment to absorb the scale of consequence. To understand what patience and watchfulness could build over lifetimes. This was the world that had waited while he slept between stars. She faced him fully then, crown catching light as if listening to it, and spoke of the search she had led alone despite counsel and caution. Others had suggested records, simulations, artificial reconstructions. But she had refused them all, insisting that truth required the living. Elias felt a quiet awe at that stubborn insistence, so achingly human. Across species and centuries, the same intuition had guided her choice. Persistence, he realized, could look like devotion without ever naming itself. He asked the question that had pressed against his ribs since waking. Why his face? Why his return? Why now after so long without answers? She answered without hesitation, explaining that the galaxy remembered patterns, and that humanity's first reach had followed a rare and dangerous alignment. The gate he built could not be replicated safely without his specific insight, and attempts made without it had ended in cautionary silence. They had needed his mind, but she had wanted his presence. Her honesty carried weight not as confession but as trust deliberately extended. Elias felt the familiar thrill of problem and purpose rising together. That old sense of standing before something vast yet approachable. He realized that while centuries had passed, his value was unchanged. Not because he was exceptional, but because humans adapted when needed. He smiled faintly, recognizing himself in the reflection of her calm resolve. Two different kinds of endurance had finally converged in one moment. She led him onward into quieter halls, where walls bore subtle reliefs, depicting meetings, losses, and compromises etched over generations. Elias noticed a small figure among them, unmistakably human in outline, standing beside alien forms with hands open rather than clenched. The carving was simplified, almost symbolic, yet unmistakably intentional. Humanity had become an idea here, shaped by one brief act of courage. He wondered how many futures rested on such small beginnings. When they stopped, the space felt private in a way only trust could create. She removed her crown and set it aside, an unspoken signal of equality. And Elias felt the weight of expectation ease into something manageable. She told him that many feared his return would disrupt a fragile peace. while others believed it would finally complete an unfinished equation. She stood between those views, choosing faith over certainty once more. Elias recognized that choice as the truest kind of leadership. They spoke then of logistics, of acclamation, of time lost and time ahead. But beneath the practical exchange flowed a deeper understanding. Neither of them was the same being who had begun this long wait. Yet both carried continuity like a thread carefully protected. Elias felt the strangeness of belonging somewhere utterly unfamiliar. A human gift for making meaning even on alien ground. He sensed that his return was not an ending, but a reopening door. As the light outside shifted toward evening hues, she watched him quietly, studying details no archive could preserve, movement and breath and intent. Elias realized she was confirming a truth she had defended for centuries. That humanity's strength lay not in technology but in resilient presence. He met her gaze without flinching, aware that history balanced there again. The galaxy had waited 300 years for this confirmation. And now it leaned forward, ready to move, because he had finally returned. The evening light slid through the high apertures as Elias followed her into deeper chambers, where sound softened and footsteps seemed absorbed by layered stone and quiet intent. He felt the city above continue its rhythm, while this place held still for decisions. And the air carried a faint mineral warmth that reminded him of Earth workshops. She spoke of a convergence approaching, a moment systems had marked with careful dread. And Elias sensed the shape of a problem before numbers ever touched his thoughts. Something was coming that could not be delayed by protocol or hope alone. She showed him a projection shaped from light and shadow, not as spectacle but as tool, revealing a fracture in mapped space that pulsed like a wound refusing closure. Attempts to stabilize it had failed because no model accounted for human improvisation, for the way his kind solved under pressure without waiting for certainty. Elias felt that old focus settle in, the quiet narrowing of attention he trusted, and he stepped closer, asking questions that made her advisors exchange glances. Human curiosity, he saw, still unsettled even the most prepared minds. As he studied the shifting geometry, memories aligned with instinctive insight. Echoes of equations scribbled on glass and corrected mid-laugh in a rain-soaked lab. The fracture was not an enemy but a misalignment, a door twisted by incomplete logic. And Elias realized that his disappearance had preserved the missing perspective. Others had refined and polished, but none had been present at the flawed beginning. He felt a strange gratitude toward time itself for holding that error intact. 300 years had passed, yet the problem still spoke his language. She watched him work with visible restraint, allowing silence to support thought. And in that quiet Elias felt the weight of her centuries of solitary vigilance. He explained slowly, choosing clarity over speed, mapping concepts with gestures, showing how flexibility, not force, could coax the fracture toward rest. The room seemed to breathe with him as systems recalibrated around his suggestions. And murmurs grew into controlled excitement as stability readings improved. Human persistence, it seemed, could still surprise the galaxy. The success carried a cost revealed only as projections widened their scope, showing that sealing the fracture would strand vessels already in transit. Elias felt the familiar tightening of responsibility settle behind his eyes, knowing that solutions often demanded sacrifice measured in personal risk. He asked how long the window would remain open, and the answer carried gravity. Only one passage remained viable, narrow and unforgiving, keyed to human thresholds. Without hesitation, Elias understood what he would offer before anyone asked. She stepped closer then, her composure finally giving way to urgency shaped by care. And for the first time she argued against him, citing precedent and consequence. Elias listened, absorbing concern without surrendering conviction, explaining that humanity's strength had always been choosing action over stasis. He spoke of trust built by showing up when equations ran out. And she recognized the truth she had guarded for centuries taking form again. Reluctantly she nodded, accepting that leadership sometimes meant letting go. Preparation unfolded with efficient calm, systems adapting to his physiology. And Elias felt the strange comfort of danger framed by competence. He noticed how the room's occupants treated him not as relic, but as partner, responding to his cues with respect earned through clarity and resolve. The fracture's pulse steadied, waiting, almost curious. And Elias sensed the alignment approaching its decisive moment. History, once more, balanced on a human willingness to step forward. Before departure, she placed a small device into his palm, warm and familiar, explaining it would anchor his signal across shifting layers of space. Their fingers lingered briefly, not as romance but as recognition of shared risk. And Elias felt the quiet affirmation of being seen beyond function or legend. She told him that whatever followed, his return had already changed outcomes. That endurance and empathy had proven as vital as any advanced design. He carried those words with him as the chamber lights dimmed to readiness. The passage opened like a held breath finally released, space folding inward. And Elias stepped toward it with practiced calm and unpracticed awe. He felt the pull of physics bending under cooperative intent. And for a moment, centuries compressed into a single purposeful stride. Behind him, she watched without flinching, trusting the choice she had defended alone. Ahead, uncertainty waited, shaped by possibility rather than fear. Humanity, Elias knew, was about to remind the galaxy why it endured. The passage closed behind Elias with a soundless certainty, and the chamber dissolved into a corridor of compressed light and motion. He felt pressure along his spine as physics bent without breaking, the device in his palm humming with a steady reassurance. Thought narrowed to action, fear translated into calculation and trust, and the fracture ahead resolved into layered planes of shimmering force. He moved forward because humans always moved when stillness failed. The fracture greeted him not as violence but as imbalance. Currents slipping past one another like mismatched gears. Elias extended his hands, not to touch but to guide, using the anchor to introduce hesitation where chaos rushed. Sensors flared as the structure responded, curious rather than hostile. And he sensed how close failure hovered beside success. This was not conquest but negotiation written in energy. Time stretched unevenly inside the fold, moments elongating into focus. Elias remembered teaching interns to listen to machines as partners, to feel when resistance meant warning instead of challenge. Here, the fracture answered that same intuition, settling when he adjusted rhythm instead of force. The galaxy's most advanced systems watched and learned in silence, as human improvisation rewrote a rule they had never questioned. Outside the fold, alarms softened into monitoring tones, and observers felt tension ease without fully releasing. She stood among them, hands clasped, crown absent, her attention fixed on readings that mirrored his pulse. Centuries of preparation condensed into fragile patience, and she realized that waiting had always been rehearsal for trust. Leadership, she knew now, sometimes meant allowing uncertainty to breathe. Inside, Elias reached the final alignment point, where the fracture narrowed into something almost delicate. He adjusted the anchor one last time, heart steady, and the currents slid into cooperation with audible relief. Stability cascaded outward, seals forming like slow crystallization, and the fold began to unwind according to shared agreement. He felt triumph arrive quietly, earned rather than declared. The return was gentler than the entry, space releasing him back into known dimensions with care. Elias staggered once, then steadied as gravity reclaimed authority. Hands caught his arms, voices overlapped in restrained celebration. And somewhere behind it, all she reached him first. Their shared glance held exhaustion, relief, and mutual understanding. A wordless confirmation that risk had been worth the cost. Reports followed, projections confirming vessels freed and systems safe. The galaxy exhaled, recalibrating futures that had waited on this result. Elias listened, detached yet present, feeling the strange aftermath of purpose fulfilled. She thanked him publicly with formal words that carried private meaning, acknowledging humanity's contribution without elevating it above others. Balance, she ensured, remained the lesson learned rather than dominance. HFY was not supremacy but steadfast participation in survival. Later, when crowds thinned and urgency faded into quiet, they walked together beneath open sky streaked with unfamiliar stars. Elias felt fatigue settle deep but satisfying, the kind earned through alignment of intent and action. She spoke of what would change now, alliances strengthened, and of what would remain, vigilance shaped by memory. He listened, aware that his return had reopened paths beyond repair alone. She asked what he would do next, the question carrying curiosity rather than expectation. Elias considered the centuries he had missed, the humanity that had grown without his witness. He spoke of teaching, of sharing mistakes as much as successes, of reminding others that solutions lived in collaboration. She smiled, seeing her long-held belief reflected in his answer. As night deepened, lights kindled across the city in patient patterns. Elias felt a sense of belonging form without ownership, a human talent for finding home in shared purpose. She told him that waiting had never been about possession, but about ensuring the right presence arrived when needed. Now that presence stood beside her, altered yet intact. 300 years had led to this quieter beginning. They stopped at a balcony overlooking layers of life and motion. The galaxy moved on, stabilized by a single human choice among many. Elias rested his hands on the stone, feeling warmth and solidity, and understood that endurance was humanity's quiet signature. She joined him there, not as ruler but as witness, and together they watched futures unfold without spectacle. What came next would be built, patiently, side by side. Morning arrived without ceremony, light filtering through layered glass that softened its entry. And Elias woke with the unfamiliar comfort of having a future to plan. The city hummed below, not with urgency now but with measured continuity, as if the night's risk had folded itself neatly into routine. He lay still for a moment, feeling gravity and breath align, and realized that survival had become something quieter than triumph. It felt like permission to stay. When he joined her later, there were no crowds waiting this time. Only a small gathering of thinkers, builders, and observers shaped by patience. She introduced him without titles, letting his presence speak for itself. And Elias felt the subtle power of that choice ripple outward. They discussed integration rather than accolades. How his knowledge would be shared, adapted, and inevitably surpassed. Humanity's role, he sensed, was to catalyze and then step aside. He spent days teaching in open chambers where questions flowed freely, hands sketching imperfect diagrams that invited improvement. Alien minds met his halfway, translating intuition into new forms, and Elias felt the joy of collaboration stripped of rivalry. Mistakes were welcomed as data rather than failure, a philosophy his species had carried quietly for generations. Progress here learned to breathe. She watched often from the margins, satisfied rather than distant, seeing the long arc of her vigilance finally bend into motion. The search that had defined her reign transformed into stewardship, less about waiting and more about guiding what had arrived. She admitted once, in a rare unguarded moment, that certainty had been less important than faith sustained over time. Elias understood that kind of courage intimately. News reached them from distant systems where stability now held. Vessels resuming paths once abandoned to probability. The fracture became a lesson archived with care, its resolution cited not as miracle but method. Elias took quiet pride in that framing, knowing that humanity thrived when its work outlived its storytellers. Legacy, he learned, was best carried anonymously. On an evening shaped by unfamiliar constellations, they returned to the balcony where futures had first steadied. The city below pulsed with life unremarkable and essential, and Elias felt the deep satisfaction of problems transformed into processes. She asked if he regretted the centuries lost to transit and sleep. He considered, then answered honestly that regret implied ownership of time. Humans, he said, borrowed moments and tried to use them well. She smiled at that, a gesture no longer burdened by waiting, and spoke of how her people would remember this era, not as the age of the returning human, but as the moment collaboration overcame isolation. Elias felt the title fit more comfortably than legend ever could. He had not been searched for to complete a story, but to help begin a better pattern. As weeks passed, his presence became ordinary, a sign that integration had succeeded more than any treaty. Children of multiple species learned equations that bent gently, taught that adaptability was not weakness but strength refined. Elias walked among them, a living reminder that fragility endured. He thought often of Earth, of rain and cracked windows, and felt no pull to return alone. When she finally asked him to stay permanently, the question carried no expectation, only openness. Elias accepted without ceremony, aware that belonging was chosen daily. The galaxy had space for him not as artifact but as participant. 300 years of waiting resolved into shared continuity. The search was over, not because it succeeded, but because it no longer needed to continue. Together they watched a new generation take first steps outward, guided by lessons learned from patience and trust. Elias felt humanity's quiet signature woven into that motion. Not dominant, not diminished, simply present where it mattered. The universe did not change all at once, but it leaned more easily toward cooperation than before. Sometimes, he realized, arrival was enough.